Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Kari and today I am doing 6 mini book reviews. I had to check because I've kind of tossed up my book reviews a little bit lately. Anyway, today's theme is nonfiction. These are the nonfiction or autobiographies that I have read in the last month and a half or so. Let's get started. The first one I'm going to talk about is the one I liked the least, which is We Are Never Talking in Real Life by Samantha Irby. This is a collection of essays about a woman, Samantha Irby, who is African American and LGBTQ. So, great, right? Diversity, representation, all for it. However, I hated this book. Hated it. It got a 1 star out of 5 for me because while the writing style was okay, grammatically and all that stuff, the content was indescribable. Let's put it that way. There's obscenity beyond what I'm comfortable with, and I'm in law school. We swear like sailors sometimes, so I don't have a problem with reading or hearing obscenity, but this just went so far beyond what I am comfortable being uncomfortable with, if that makes sense. Also, she's incredibly self-deprecating, which again, that's fine, but it did go to the point of self-hatred. And also, she seems to verbally abuse her cat, which I also didn't particularly like, but that's not one of my big pet peeves. It just felt very rough and angry and bitter and everything I didn't want to read in a book, which I rarely have this many bad things to say about a book because I like most of what I read. But I honestly hated this book. Moving on to the much better books, I read the Young Reader's edition of Life in Motion by Misty Copeland. This book is an autobiography targeted at maybe 10 to 13-year-olds about Misty Copeland, who is the first African-American principal ballerina in the American Ballet Theatre. I loved the story. As I've said before, this version is a little bit simple, so I'm reading the adult version this month, but it was really fun to see how her life changed and all the stuff that she had to go through and the distance between herself and her other fellow dancers simply because of the fact that she was African American. Again, I enjoyed this book, but I am looking forward to reading the adult version. I gave this one a 3 out of 5 stars simply for the simplicity of it being targeted to 10 to 13-year-olds. I also read Heartberries by Teresa Marie Mailhot, which is an autobiography of a Native American woman. This is first of all, this is Emma Watson's pick for her book club for March and April. That's why I'm reading it. Second of all, I didn't expect this book to have quite so much of an impact on me. You almost have to read this book multiple times to get to the heart of it. But it's also one of those books where you take out of it what you want to take out. It's a fairly small book. I mean, it's just barely bigger than my hand, and it's pretty short too. But when I sat down to read it, and I know I sound a little bit crazy, but I'm okay with that, there was almost this physical sense of awe in reading it. I have no idea why, I don't know where it came from, I don't know what happened, but it was there. I really enjoyed that sense of over amazing fragility, which again doesn't make sense, but I enjoyed that sense when I was reading this book. There's a lot of harder themes in this book as well that I enjoyed. The writing was journalistic without seeming like it was a newspaper clipping, which I've noticed is a bit of a problem with journalists who go to write a book. They don't know how all the time to write a full-length book without seeming like a collection of newspaper articles, which I think is maybe why a lot of them write a collection of essays. But I really like the writing style in this. It was just flowy and simple and profound. That's a good word. So I gave this one a 5 out of 5 stars. I read Evicted by Matthew Desmond. This book was given to me by one of my aunts for my birthday last year. And the premise of this book is that that eviction causes poverty. I think it's an interesting premise. My biggest problem with it is that it didn't seem to play out for me. In this book, he follows 6 families in Milwaukee as they get evicted basically repeatedly, and go from maybe upper lower class to lower class in most cases, and it was heart-wrenching to read. This shouldn't happen to anybody, especially in Wisconsin, because it is cold in Wisconsin. But since most of them started out living in these not-so-great places at the beginning of the book, and then were evicted, it didn't seem to me like eviction caused poverty. They were already impoverished, so how can it didn't make sense to me. And I think I think maybe this premise could be proven, or at least convince me, if there was more research and he followed somebody who wasn't already impoverished go through this slide. That said, he does a good job of showing these families as human. He shows landlords, families, single people, all of it. There's a great range in this book, and I think he does a good job at covering that. He just, like I said, starts where they're already in poverty, in my eyes, and I didn't enjoy that quite so much. But I did give this one a 3.5 out of 5. I also read The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. This is about the Chicago World's Fair in 1892-3 and the serial killings that were happening at the same time. I hadn't heard about the serial killer before. I knew vaguely about the Chicago World's Fair, but beyond that I had no idea. This book was not at all what I expected it to be, but overall it's also not my favorite. I'm a little bit hesitant to read anything by Erik Larson. Not because it was a bad book. The writing was good, there's a lot of research in this book, and it was incredibly well done that way. But just because this isn't necessarily something that I would want. He focused a lot on the architecture of the fair itself and the higher-ups who were working on the fair, getting their project done and pushing it through, and then he would add in tidbits about the murderer, Holmes. I think it was interesting about Holmes, but I'm not entirely sure, beyond the fact that it happened at the same time, why Larson felt the need to put them both in the same book. I would have liked to see more about the description of the fairs, the people who went there, honestly the actual description of the fairs, the colors, the smells, sounds, that kind of stuff, and maybe even a little bit of a comparison to the French World's Fair and the Crystal Palace in the UK in the 1850s. Simply because they all sound very similar to me, so now I have to go and find something about those. But this, again, this was a good book, just not necessarily one of my favorites. I think I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, because I loved the historical tidbits that he would just sort of drop in there. Towards the beginning, there's something about 1890 or 1891, and a young girl, Lizzie, gives her mother 40 whacks. Like, yeah, we all know the rhyme, it's hysterical. The tidbit, not the fact that she killed her parents. Or the Disney tidbit that I mentioned in my March wrap-up, that Walt was really inspired by what his father told him since Elias worked at the World's Fair. Stuff like that I really enjoyed, but I just wanted to immerse myself in the World's Fair, and this book didn't quite do that. The last nonfiction book is The Burning Time by Virginia Rounding. This covers the burnings of heretics, which is namely Protestants, maybe a couple of Catholics, during the times of Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary I, which is 1528 to 1558. First of all, I love this cover, I just think it's really fun. Second of all, the author did a really good job at putting all of these burnings together. It's not a collection of biographies. This person got killed because of this, Anne Askew got racked and killed because she was a Protestant, you know, and so on and so forth. It was definitely a well thought out, coherent, cohesive book. I don't actually have criticisms of this book. I don't. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 5 out of 5. At the end of the book, she even talks about the differences and the similarities between the Protestant and Catholic divide in the 1500s to the Islam-Christian divide now. And I think that was a really interesting take on it, because they are very similar, those divides, in many, many ways, and she does a great job of explaining that without seeming like she's attacking anybody, or without attacking anybody in reality either. I think my favorite part of this book was the details of the religions. She goes not really in depth, but she does discuss the Anabaptists or the Calvinists, etc., and just little things that made them different. She also discusses Catholicism versus Protestantism as a whole. For example, I did not know that transubstantiation was the issue to avoid mentioning when you were on trial. In case you're not aware, because I definitely was not, transubstantiation is the belief in Catholicism that the bread and wine you take at communion actually turn into the blood and body of Christ. They maintain the appearance of wine and bread, but they are actually his body and his blood. Which seems cannibalistic to me, but I'm not Catholic. And I'm not entirely sure that that belief is fully in the common Catholic faith these days, but I don't know much about religion. But I found that a really interesting point, because in each of the trials that she went through, which was most of them, she mentioned this person tried to avoid substantiation. The questioner asked, "What do you think of the blood and body of Christ?" And then they were dancing around the question. They were obfuscating their answer because they didn't want to be burned for saying it's just blood and wine. It's a representative of his body, but it's not actually his body or his blood. So I really enjoyed that, and I really loved seeing some of the nuances in the religions and the denominations of the time. That is all I have for my 6 nonfiction book reviews today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a big thumbs up down below. If you want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button down below. As always, I will leave my Goodreads linked in the down bar. But until my next video, bye.